I asked her again today about what she remembers. That is, nothing, me and Samantha. Sam for short, had been best friends for some time. We met in 7th grade, but really only became close after our freshman year. That's 9th grade for anyone that doesn't know. We were weird and awkward. And unabashedly so. We even spent a year as each other's beards. That was a crazy experience to say the least. Anywho, what I'm trying to get at is that we were close, brother and sister. One might say she was pretty fun, with a knack for photography and a love of British television. So I was surprised when Sam decided to leave Kansas City and attend college down in the southern part of the state. Sure, it wasn't bad per se, but it just felt like a strange shift given that this was the girl that had certainly watched more cinematic flyover shots of the London Eye than she was ever willing to admit. The high school graduation was tearful. As expected, losing a friend always is. I suppose I stayed for college. She went. That's just how things were going to be. We kept in touch for a semester or two, but, predictably, the messages gradually slowed before stopping altogether. To me, a lowly Kansas citizen, the southern half of the state is almost like a different country entirely. Driving down near Joplin and Springfield, I'm always surprised by the change in accent most of all. It's a subtle, yet emblematic thing to hear Mr. E transform into Mr. A as Midwest culture becomes southern in general. I think there is a kind of lingering mystique that surrounds the place for us northerners from KC and St. Louis, the Ozarks. A wild and untamed land where Bigfoots roam free on the hilltops. Silly, but it's a real sentiment. It was last fall when I received a message from my old friend down south after years of silence. There was nothing particularly odd about it. The normal hey and how are you? And wow, I've almost got my diploma too. Applied, but then it was straight to business. Gotta take a few photos for a final. Want to join me for a night on the trail? Not sure about doing it alone. Hiking, camping, wildlife. Was this still the same person that would dance around, TARDIS phone case in hand, going on about her dreams of being a professional photographer in metropolitan England? Still, I accepted. It would be a nice time to get away, get some exercise, and catch up on all the highs and lows in person. On a more selfish note, my own finals were coming up soon, and getting a breather before then sounded like a fantastic idea. The trailhead was about an hour's drive outside of Springfield. I had gotten up at the early college student time of 12 p.m. to make it. It was around 4 p.m. when I pulled up into the mostly empty gravel parking lot. Sam's car was the only one there, but she was already out, fiddling with camera straps and other related supplies, while tossing in a couple handfuls of granola bars to last through the night and early morning. It was hard to believe that it had been so long since we had last seen each other. She looked exactly like my memories of her, and, despite my initial worries, greeted me with a smile as lighthearted and carefree as I remembered. Soon enough we got on our way, the gravel of the parking lot eventually giving way to dirt paths. I had never truly experienced the Ozarks before. Not really, anyway. I'd driven through the place, as most other North Missourians had at some point or another, but never stopped for anything more than gas. I'm not exactly sure why I had expected something drastically different from my city. Only some 200 miles away, the trees were all naked and bare. The leaves had already been shed and covered the forest floor with the usual decaying brown. It started to get me curious about what it was she was searching for in that barren country. So what's the project? Looking for anything in particular? I think so. I squinted at her as she played with the Kodak hanging from her neck. We must have walked another half hour before she elaborated further. You know when you've got a really good feeling about something, like something good is right on the cusp of happening. I've been getting one of those about this place for a while now. No, I laughed, only somewhat jokingly. Well, you're my Watson out here, asshole. So how about trying to make sure I don't do anything too fucking stupid? I smiled at that. It was nice to know that despite all the years, some things remain the same. We rounded a corner and found ourselves at a bluff overlooking the entire area. Hillocks and hills covered by endless waves of sterile treetops. A small, muddy creek ran between the deep valleys, vanishing into the ridges just as suddenly as it seemed to appear. It was difficult to take in the sheer scale of the place. I recall looking down at the slope leading to the water's edge. I had that urge. I could jump. Maybe I would survive. Maybe I wouldn't. Perhaps someone would find me. Perhaps they wouldn't. Perhaps they couldn't. Dusk shots really helped to bring out the forest's character. Apparently, Sam told me that. As I struggled to pitch the cheap Walmart tent she had brought for the both of us, we had found a place to set up camp some ways off the trail and behind a small outcropping. I watched her between my failed attempts as she sized up different angles of overhead branches and rotting wood bark. Some pictures she took with a bright camera flash, some without. Better to get everything possible while we were there, I supposed. Before too long, though, we were huddled inside against the bitter fall air as night began to come round. She threw me a breakfast bar, our flashlights following its arc through the tent. Get everything you needed? I asked, taking a bite of honeyed granola. She froze for a moment, as if thinking hard about how best to answer. Not yet. That was spooky. I laughed all the same, trying to mask the strange uneasiness that had come over me. What else did you want to get a shot of? I don't know. She shrugged. I've still got that weird feeling. And with that, the conversation was settled. We finished our preparations for bed and drifted off. Sleep has a way of coming and going without telling me. The next thing I remember was lying in my cozy sleeping bag with my eyes open, even in my hazy, half-asleep state. I recall being struck by the utter silence. No animals. Gray shadows of trees stood motionless over the canvas. No wind either, but the atmosphere didn't feel peaceful. It felt suffocating. Then a flash of light. Lightning. No, it wasn't storming. Off to one side of the tent, I was sure I'd seen the faintest camera flash. I reached toward the opposing sleeping bag. She was gone. My hands pulled and yanked at the thing, as if I would find her buried somewhere within, but only the warm cushions of her bed remained. I sat up, feeling about the tent as I did so. My pack was still there. Hers too. Flashlights, phones, jackets, all accounted for. But the camera was gone. Something that simple was enough to set me off, rubbing my eyes. I moved to unzip the tent door. Outside, the light cast by the moon covered the trees in a kind of silvery gloom. I stuck my head out first, half expecting Sam to be just a few feet away taking stupid midnight selfies. Instead, there were just empty shadows of trunks and rocks. The night was cold and desolate. I remember my teeth beginning to chatter as I clicked on the flashlight and began shining it at the surrounding woods. The trees were endless. Withered leaves crunched against my feet as I scanned the immediate area, looking up and down the brown bark for any sign of Sam. Everything looked the same. The same trees, the same rocks, the same dark and dusty ground. After a few minutes, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I started to scream, Sam, Samantha. Maybe I was genuinely concerned. Maybe I was just lonely. I'm not really sure. I wandered then, aimlessly, like I was reliving a childhood memory of being lost in the mall searching for my parents. I ran about, fumbling over loose stones and my own 2 feet without any sense of direction. All the while, the faint echoes of my yells taunted me. Sam, Samantha, where are you? Choking on a breath of cool air finally brought some sense back into me. I didn't know where I was, how long or how far I had strayed from the safety of the tent. Then, as I continued waving the light at my surroundings, I saw her about 30 feet from me. She was facing away, yet gazing slightly skyward at the branches overhead. Even from this distance, I could see the faint reflective glow of the camera strap around her neck's backside. She was shivering too, her jacket having been left behind with all her other belongings, all except the one. She turned to face me suddenly. It was her, tired and exhausted, but her. My eyes watered somewhat as tears of relief began to form. Sam, in contrast, stared at me blankly, her pupils, perhaps, adjusting to the brightness of my flashlight. Christ, Sam, what are you doing out here? She didn't respond. Instead, she walked calmly, swiftly, but calmly, over to me. Turn it off. I complied without argument, fear suddenly overtaking me again. Back to the tent. No talking. She grabbed my arm, leading me away into the blackness. Despite the obvious lack of light, her pace never faltered. I stumbled, tripping over overgrown roots and discarded sticks, as she continued to drag me along through the forest. Every shadow seemed to harbor something sinister. I didn't know what was happening, and somehow that confusion only made me all the more terrified. Was it a bear? Bobcats? Coyotes? Was someone else out here with us? Within a couple minutes, we had arrived back at the small clearing where our tent lay undisturbed. She released me, the strength of the grip only becoming apparent after it was gone. I watched that silhouette mechanically unzip the tent door flap in the darkness. One of the blackened hands pointed commandingly at the interior, as if I had any other choice but to obey. Then she followed me in, sealing the entrance behind her. Did it touch you? The voice was firm and steady, as her figure turned to face me, still featureless. What the fuck are you talking about? Did what touch me? Did it touch you? The tone came more seriously this time. No, get some rest. And without saying another word, she collapsed down onto her sleeping bag. Wait, I gasped, finally realizing that it was probably best to keep to a whisper. Tell me what the hell is going on. What is out there? But there was no reply. In the darkness, I couldn't tell if her eyes were open or if she truly had faded off to sleep, and I didn't have the courage to flick on my flashlight to check. Despite that, I remember sitting there for an hour or so. It's hard to estimate time when you can't see anything. I listened for any hint of movement, any crackling of branches or rustling of fallen leaves. But there was nothing, just nothing. As the minutes went by, my fear gradually gave way to tiredness, and I allowed myself to lay back down and rest. I awoke at dawn to the sound of Sam rummaging through her pack. Finally awake. Huh, she snorted playfully. Dude, I groaned. Let's eat and get moving. She tossed a granola bar at my face with a friendly smirk. It was only when I reached to grab it that I noticed a faint redness on my arm from where she had grabbed me the previous night. I blinked as the memories slowly started to come back to me. It all felt too surreal to be true. Hey, what happened last night? I don't know. Slept like a rock. Not the answer I was looking for. You don't remember anything happening? Nope, it was humorous, if a tad dismissive. I'm going to go stretch a bit before we head back. And with that she rose and exited, acting as if the matter was finished and done, while she shuffled around outside. I sat there thinking about the previous night's events. What had even happened? What had she been doing out there? The questions picked at me as I sat up and stared at the camera sitting idle next to her backpack. The tent was easier to put away than to put up. Dirt flicked around as I tried to organize the cheap canvas as well as my thoughts. Sam sat on the side, surveying the surroundings with an unusual keenness. Yet, despite my inner and external hassles, within the hour we had breakfasted and broke camp. For me, the return walk was tense. I took a chance and pressed her again on what she could recall, but she waved me off uncaringly. There was something off about the situation, familiar perhaps, but off. I got into the habit of walking just a pace or two behind her dusty footprints. She was more chipper than I expected, even more so than yesterday, when she actually had gotten a proper breakfast and a shower. I am so goddamn happy to finally move on from this place. I'm gonna get my degree and be out of here. I looked in her direction with a raised eyebrow, the strangeness of the tone eating away at me. Hey, can I see what sort of pictures you've taken? I ran up and reached prematurely at the camera around her neck. She stopped and grabbed my wrist before I could touch it. For 1 second the grasp was solid. I thought for that moment she'd break my hand, but in the end she let go with a shrug, handing the old Kodak over to me without a fuss. Trees and branches among a background of sky. A few interesting rock formations. A view overlooking the shallow creek from above. But as for anything that stood out to me, there was nothing. There was not even a single nighttime photograph to somewhat confirm my suspicions. Well, she eyed me expectantly as I handed the camera back to her. Looks good. Got a lot of cool shots. The remainder of the trek back to our cars was mostly silent. I thought about bringing up what I personally remembered from the night before, but stopped myself. I doubted that I would be getting any real answers from doing so. Other than a few sarcastic eye rolls, the lot was still mostly empty. Our cars were sitting next to each other, just as we had left them. Goodbyes were exchanged. Hugs too. Promises to keep in touch followed. Then I drove off, determined to get home. We've both graduated now. She's mentioned in texts how she's looking into living abroad somewhere. I've told her it would be a nice change. I mean it, but I've also continued to bother her about that day, trying to understand what she was doing when I found her there, alone in the woods. She still says she doesn't remember anything about what happened that night in the Ozarks. I'm not sure if I believe her.